I'd like to begin this evening with a story and a paradox. One brisk autumn evening in 1831, some 200 or so Worcesterites assembled in a hall not too far from here to honor Worcester's history. After music, a parade led by the governor, and a sumptuous dinner, members of the Worcester Historical Society offered a series of prepared and to us rather peculiar toasts for the evening. They toasted the day, the personal estates of our ancestors, the old colony. They made a toast to the inhabitants of Worcester County and to the ancient dowry of a farmer's daughter, a bed, a cow, a spinning wheel, and a cradle. And they made, to me, the most peculiar toast of the evening. In 1831, these well-heeled Worcester men offered a toast to King Philip. Had we lived in the days of our forefathers, as an enemy we would have slain him, but today the present generation may safely express their respect for his patriotism. Now that last is quite a toast. And here's the paradox of it. How could these very well-heeled Worcester men so baldly declare both their admiration for Philip and their zeal to kill him if they'd had the chance? We might allow perhaps that they were a little bit more drunken at the time when they came up with this toast, but I'm not sure that that explains it fully to us. And I hope that by the end of my talk this evening, we'll have arrived at an answer to this seeming paradox. And finally, about how the war has been remembered. King Philip's War, of course, it must be said at the outset, was named after a Wampanoag Indian sachem who took the English name of Philip and whom the colonists referred to as a king. His Indian name, his Algonquin Indian name earlier in his life was Metacom, and some records call him by that name, just for clarification's purposes. In proportion to population, King Philip's War was the most fatal war in American history. Yet Indian losses were far greater. Colonial armies with their Pequot and Mohegan allies pursued enemy Indians from Narragansett Bay to the Connecticut River Valley, killing warriors in their fields and families in their homes. Those Algonquins who fought with the English, who fought against the English, saw their communities decimated. Thousands were killed in the fighting, while thousands more died of disease or starvation, or were shipped out of the colonies to the West Indies to be sold as slaves. Those Indians who retreated beyond the Connecticut River found themselves fighting on two fronts, with their traditional Iroquois enemies, the Mohawks, to the west, and with the English to the east. Closer to the Atlantic, not even Christian Indians loyal to the English were spared. In the fall of 1675, most were removed from their towns and imprisoned on barren islands in Boston Harbor, where many died of cold or hunger during the long winter. Always brutal and everywhere fierce, King Philip's War proved to be not only the most fatal war in American history, but also one of the most merciless. So within these actions, I think we can very clearly see that the Indians were interested in attacking Christianity. The English had indeed been attempting to convert many Algonquin Indians to Christianity before the war, and Philip himself was decidedly hostile to these efforts of conversion. He felt that they were taking Indians out of his sovereignty, and he was losing control over them. They were losing their Indianness and converting to Christianity. And within the war, these attacks on Christianity by Indians, I think, are a very clear message. By 1676, accounts had been printed not just in London, but also in Boston and in Cambridge in Massachusetts. Let's see if I can do this. Among them, the Puritan minister Increase Mather's own history of the war. Mather published several sermons that he gave over the course of the war as well. But his brief history of the war, published in Boston and then also in London at the same time, is one of the more famous printed versions of stories of the war. These later accounts are not news reports. They tend to be more somber reflections in which people like Puritan ministers try to grapple more specifically with the moral consequences of engaging in what was considered to be by many an unjust war, or at the very least a war that was fought beyond the normal restraints of warfare. In effect, the first year of the war brought with it a tremendous outpouring of print. At least 20 different editions of printed narratives appeared in London, Boston, or Cambridge. Many appeared in more than one edition. They were so popular that they went into multiple editions, for a total of no less than 30 separate printings. Even in an era which is, of course, profoundly less print-oriented than our own, in which books are quite rare, the ability to read them is extremely rare, many books about King Philip's War were printed and were read, were vastly popular, including the best-known narrative of King Philip's War, Mary Rowlandson's dramatic captivity narrative. Rowlandson, of course, was the wife of the minister of the town of Lancaster, taken captive by Nipmunks for 3 months. wrote an account of her captivity, which later was published in 1682, went through 4 editions, and was America's first bestseller. There were at least 20,000 copies of books about King Philip's War circulating in the Anglo-American book market during and immediately after the war. In these writings, these early writings about King Philip's War, Philip is not necessarily central. Really, the devastation of the war is the central actor in these stories. But to the extent that Philip is portrayed, he's portrayed as a villainous, treacherous monster, a blasphemous villain, the worst kind of possible savage. And these counts were likely to spend considerable time celebrating Philip's very violent death in August of 1676, when he was shot, drawn and quartered, and his head was staked on a pole and brought to Plymouth. And it happened to be that on the day that Philip's head arrived in Plymouth, people of Plymouth were celebrating a day of Thanksgiving for recent victories in the war. The irony of which was not lost on the Puritans themselves. Philip's father, Massasoit, is the Wampanoag sachem who we know from the story of the first Thanksgiving in 1621, who sat down to feast with the Indians. In 1676, Philip's Massasoit's son arrives at a Thanksgiving feast. His decapitated head arrives, and the Puritan minister Increase Mather, the author of this account we're looking at now, declared that Philip's head was a welcome sight and would be meat to the people inhabiting the wilderness on this their festive day of Thanksgiving. Memories of the war remained fresh in the colonists' minds for decades. Increase Mather's son Cotton, decades later, traveled to Plymouth, where Philip's head, his skull now, continued to remain staked on a pole in the town of Plymouth for public viewing. And Mather climbed up to the top of the pole and pulled Philip's jawbone off of the skull. And I think it's a significant action because it shows just how powerfully the colonists felt about King Philip's War, even a generation later. But it suggests just how powerfully Cotton Mather, like Increase Mather before him, was interested in silencing Philip, in literally taking away his mouth, even after his death, taking away his jawbone, silencing all kinds of possibilities for Indian versions of the story of King Philip's War. Those taunts, those attacks on Puritan Christianity, those attacks on English agricultural practice, those needed to be silenced even in Cotton Mather's generation, that a possible different kind of story of the war could be told on the eve of the war. Gookin decided that it was an unfair portrayal of the war to not pay attention to the Christian Indian story about the war. And he wrote an account, a historical account of the doings and sufferings of the Christian Indians in New England, presented it for publication, and it was denied publication. It was not actually published until 1836, when it was published by the American Antiquarian Society in their collections in 1836. But I tell this story to suggest to you that, like Cotton Mather's pulling of Philip's jawbone off of the skull, the failure of Daniel Gookin to publish an account of King Philip's War that was sympathetic to any Indians, in this case Christian Indians, suggests just how powerfully the Puritans were interested in telling their own side of the story about the war. But I think the story of King Philip's War, from how the war was waged, to how the war was written about, to how it has been remembered over the last centuries, is a story about American identity, and how American identity is founded on a clash of cultures. That American identity rests on a legacy both of cultural exchange and cultural borrowing, and on a legacy of conquest. King Philip's War also shows us that all wars are just as much a contest for meaning and for memory as they are for territory. And it shows us that the East, or at the very least New England, was won not by the sword, but by the pen as well, since that literal advantage that the Puritans had in the first place was what ensured their victory for that first century of its legacy. In 1676, Puritans in New England understood King Philip's War as a rebuke from God, considered Philip a savage villain, and utterly ignored Indian explanations for the war. A century later, American revolutionaries told the story of King Philip's War to rouse anti-British sentiment. In the 1830s, Americans across the country flocked to theaters to see Edwin Forrest play Metamora on stage and to worship him as an all-American ancestor. Today, the story of the war is celebrated and protested and rewritten by Native American peoples in New England who are seeking to hold on to their own Indian identity. All of these tellings and retellings and resurrections shape who we are today. Sitting in a room not far from where well-heeled Worcester men once offered a toast to Philip, pledging to admire him, but also declaring that if they'd had the chance, they would have happily slain him. we are reminded that we are a people with a complicated ancestry. Thank you. Okay, the question was how can we compare the losses of to population of Indians versus the losses to colonists, as also compared to their initial population on the eve of the war? So, okay, unfortunately, we don't know a whole lot about Indian population in New England on the eve of the war, and we know even less in terms of actual numbers about their losses, partly because the colonists weren't very eager to keep close track of such matters, and partly because they weren't actually able to keep very close track of matters. The colonists lost 1 in 10 colonists, so a literal decimation of the population. I think Indian losses were far, far greater, partly because at the end of the war, most Algonquin men who had fought against the English were sold into slavery and shipped to the West Indies, and most of them would have died during the passage, or would have died very quickly soon after arrival. And during the war, the Indians suffered a great number of losses to starvation and exposure, like the Christian Indians who were sent to Deer Island in Boston Harbor. Just simply didn't have the means to take care of themselves. So I think that there were numbers of different ways that Indians were vulnerable during the war, no matter where they were during the war, and colonists had more opportunity to protect themselves and simply to retreat towards the coast, and they weren't as likely to die from starvation. So I certainly think that Indian losses were greater. I can't give you actual numbers of their losses because they're simply not really recoverable at this point. The protest in Plymouth last Thanksgiving, you may remember it from local news coverage. It has been a tradition for at least 10 years that a group of Native Americans on Thanksgiving Day, when the town of Plymouth holds a parade called Pilgrim's Progress, to stage a protest of that parade. And quite explicitly, the protest was always staged in the name of King Philip. And on one occasion, that group attempted to bury Plymouth Rock. And this past fall, the Plymouth police had attempted to interfere with the process, with the smooth progress of the parade, and a number of the activists were arrested, and numbers of their non-Native American activists were arrested as well. So yeah, this contest between what meaning we put on our colonial past is one that is with us today, and one that can, in some instances, come actually to violence.
How much help did they get here from the other, say the Germans or the Dutch? You speak just about the English fighting this war. Did the other colonists offer to help? And how much did the Indians help the English here, the Indians that, that were on their side?
Okay, the question was what kind of alliances aided the English in the cause of the war? The English feared above all that the Dutch were actually supplying Phillip's side with guns, and there's some possibility that they were doing that. There's some evidence to support that. They didn't have other European, non-English European support. They had a lot of anger coming to them from England, because a lot of people in England were suspicious that the Puritans had provoked this war as just a simple means to take new lands. So they didn't actually have a lot of help from other Europeans. They did have a fair amount of help from other Indian groups. The Pequots and Mohegans did serve at some point in the war alongside the English, although there were some questions about how loyal they really were to the English, how carefully they aimed when they were firing. And the Christian Indians who had converted to Christianity and considered themselves loyal to the English were sometimes taken off Deer Island and made available for service during the war. Sadly, then at the end of the war, even though they had been promised their freedom, some of them were indiscriminately rounded up and sent off into slavery, even though they had served alongside. Because at the end of the war, the English sort of threw up their hands and said, we're not going to discriminate. We cannot tell the difference between a good Indian and a bad Indian. And this very racialized notion that there's no possibility of there being a good Indian led to a kind of failure to protect Indian allies at the end of the war.
Do you see a parallel between the Christian Indians imprisoned on Deer Island and the Japanese evacuated on the West Coast in World War II? The Japanese from fear. Were the Christian Indians imprisoned because of fear or because of demonizing?
The question was whether there's a parallel that we could usefully draw between the confinement of the Nisei in World War II, the Japanese Americans who were confined in the west coast of this country during the war, and the confinement of Christian Indians during King Philip's War. Sure, there's an obvious parallel there in the sense that the idea that the Puritans had, they didn't think that it was possible to be an Indian who was loyal to England. in the same way that the American government did not believe it was possible to be a Japanese American and be loyal to the United States. There's a failure to believe that that's a possibility, and an expectation that these people are traitors within our midst, and that's why the Indians were indeed confined. Yeah.
Do you have any information on how the Native Americans felt when one of their ancestors all of a sudden took a transition between being an enemy to being like a national hero through a form of entertainment?
Okay, yeah, that's a great question, something I didn't really get to talk about here today. It's something I talk about at some length in the book. The question was, how did Indian peoples in the 19th century respond to this really pretty bizarre transformation of Philip from this horrible villain in 1770 to this great all-American hero in the 1830s? They responded in a very savvy way. In New England, what two groups in particular, the Penobscots and the Mashpees, did was take advantage of New Englanders' newfound veneration of Philip and use it to their own political ends. So they would do things like attend performances of this play. And there's this great instance when Penobscots come to town, and one day they attend a performance of Metamora, and they're also at the same time in town lobbying for claims to their own, retaining their own land before the State House. And the Mashpee Wampanoags submit petitions to the state of Massachusetts declaring that they have the right to govern themselves, partly on the basis of the kind of sentiment, the embrace of the noble savage that the play Metamora represents. And they also take the opportunity to remind New Englanders that they themselves and their own ancestors served on the patriot side in the American Revolution, that you don't need to go back as far as the 17th century to find an Indian patriot. You can find Penobscots who fought in the Revolution. So in just the kind of subtle, sophisticated political way that revolutionaries used the story of King Philip's War in the 1770s as a propaganda tool, Native American groups in the 1830s used the romanticization of Philip as a way to try to advance their own political causes.
When the Indians fought Indians, were the results just as bloody as in King Philip's War?
The question is, when Indians fought Indians, were the results just as bloody as in King Philip's War? Well, that's harder to measure because who's recording it, for one thing. You assume then that you have a colonist who's there, and then you have, the sort of corruption of the evidence question, because is there a way in which the war is being fought differently because the English are at some level involved enough to be there? So it would be a hard question to answer. A lot of people at the time thought that the Indians were fighting beyond what their traditional restraints were on warfare during King Philip's War, that in previous conflicts with other Indians and with the colonists, that they had in fact restrained themselves to wars that were not intended to be as fatal as the kind of all-out war that King Philip's War became. So my guess would be that those Indian-on-Indian conflicts, especially before King Philip's War, were probably less merciless. Let me get someone in the back there.
That swing you mentioned in the attitude of the 1830s, that certainly swung back, though, in the next 40 years after that, would you say, or not?
The sermon?
No, the swing in attitude about Philip.
Okay, yeah.
I've read several histories of my town, Lancaster, where they're very critical of Philip by the late...
The question is, did this heroization of Philip in the 1830s, did that become a permanent part of American life? No, it didn't. It swung back. By the end of the 19th century, by the 1880s, well, one indication is the play Metamora is restaged in 1877, the 200th anniversary of the end of King Philip's War, and it's a complete flop. No one will go to it, and all the reviews say, how did anyone ever go to this horrible play where people would sit around and applaud King Philip, this bloody barbarian who's killing people just like people are being killed out west in the Plains Wars today? It's the Plains warfare and the violence of Plains warfare in the latter half of the 19th century that makes the romanticization of people like Philip impossible. Americans, white Americans, suddenly say, well, that we cannot actually worship Indians as our own ancestors anymore. We have this new reality of conflict before us.
Was he killed by the English or by his own people?
The question was Philip killed by the English or by his own people? He was killed by a party of English soldiers, but the actual person who shot him dead was an Indian scout.
I've read several books about the King Philip War, and many of them indicate that King Philip was actually the king of the Wampanoags, who the conflict began with the Wampanoags and the English. But after that, the conflict spread throughout the Indians of southern New England, and King Philip really wasn't the leader. He wasn't there at most of the conflicts, and he wasn't the tactician behind the moves. You know, I'd like you to address that.
Okay. The comment was from someone who had read numerous histories of King Philip's War that, in fact, Philip was not a leader of a confederation who had a particular kind of political and military authority or tactical responsibility, that in fact other Indians joined the conflict for their own reasons and fought to achieve their own particular goals. And I think that is true, is pretty much supported by the evidence. Philip only becomes the central character of the war later on, when the war is retold as this romantic tale of this patriot struggling to free his people from foreign tyranny. And then he becomes much more central to the story of the war. But it is true that the colonists at the time did fixate on Philip as the enemy they most wanted to get. That in their mind, when Philip was dead, the war would be over. I mean, he was a significant symbolic leader for many different Indian groups, if only that his defeat, because he was one of the last holdouts by the end of the war, meant a kind of defeat of whatever different causes people came to with. But it's certainly true that in the 19th century, Philip's military role was greatly exaggerated by historians who were interested in heroizing him. Yeah.
How many English settlers were in New England? Were 1,000 or 5,000?
Several tens of thousands. I'm not sure exactly what the size of the population was. Between 1630 and 1640 alone, at least 20,000 migrants came. So by the 1670s, there's not a lot more new migrants, but there's those 20,000 settlers, plus others who've come, plus their descendants, and a whole new generation. So several tens of thousands.
There's a rock in Bristol that's supposed to be his throne.
Yeah, there is. Has anyone been to the rock in Bristol that's called King Philip's Seat? Yeah, a few people have. There is, in Bristol, Rhode Island, on the site of the Hafen-Refer Museum of Anthropology, which is a Brown University museum, there is a rock formation that I've climbed up with my dog that sort of looks like a bit of a seat you can climb up and sort of kind of wedge yourself into it. And the myth is that Philip sat at this site and addressed his counselors and prepared them for war. Whether or not he actually did is not necessarily is not really necessarily documentable, but certainly that was his headquarters or his homeland at the time of the war.
Yeah. You mentioned a book that was denied publication about the Christian Indians. Is that something that was salvaged by you, perhaps?
No, the question was about the book that I mentioned in the course of my lecture, the book that was written in 1677 about the Christian Indian experience and what actually happened to it. Daniel Gookin sent it to London, to the Society for the Preservation of the Gospel in New England, with the intent of their publishing it, and they simply put it aside. A copy of it was later discovered, not by me, and it was printed by the American Antiquarian Society in 1836, when they were publishing lots of material about Indians, partly because the 1830s is when Indians are really romanticized. There's a lot of interest in Indians, and things like Daniel Gookin's account of the Christian Indians' experience in the war are real novelty items, are very exciting. People are interested in accumulating documents about Indian experience for that reason. So it resurfaces then, and we're lucky to have it. It has lots of information that doesn't exist elsewhere. The kind of documents that I found that haven't been seen before, haven't been thought about before, that I use as my evidence for Indian perspective, there are lots of documents in the Massachusetts State Archives that are petitions written by Christian Indians. For instance, a man writes in and says, "You have my sister in jail, you're going to sell her to Barbados, and she's my sister. And I served as a spy for you during the war. Please, please, please don't sell her into slavery." And so there are these really interesting petitions that exist that other historians haven't actually really looked at. So there are some materials I've unearthed that haven't been seen before, and are really exciting finds, I think.
As a result of your research, what's your objective opinion as to the real causes of King Philip's War?
The question was, what's my opinion on the basis of my research of the real causes behind King Philip's War? Land, 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 and more land was really the basic cause. The question of territory, there was just a finite amount of territory that both peoples wanted. But I think at heart there was also a conflict over just the clash of cultures. I believe that by the eve of the war, The English were really worried that they had become quite Indianized, and the Indians were really worried that they had been contaminated by the English. The Indians worried that too many of them had become Christian, too many of them were speaking English, wearing English clothes, some were even living in English houses, and Philip complains about this when he meets with negotiators on the eve of the war. Meanwhile, the Puritans are giving sermons left and right saying, we've all become too Indianized, this is a disaster, we're losing our Puritanness, we're losing our Englishness. I think the blurring of the two cultures led both sides to just be anxious about living alongside one another and felt the need to push apart. And I think that happens again and again in American history.
I know you will all want to join me in thanking Jill for a wonderful talk and also congratulating her on the publication of this very interesting and exciting book that tells us so much about what happened 300 years ago and what it means to us today in New England. Are just coming into bookstores now, and if your local bookstore doesn't have it, don't hesitate to ask them to order it. We do have a few copies left for sale, and we are taking the orders up here, the sales up here. There are very few copies left, but Jill will be happy to autograph.